The TCL Nxtpaper 70 Pro is the 5th Nxtpaper phone I've used, and it's the easiest one to recommend so far. Not because it's trying to win on flagship specs, but because it finally strikes a really solid balance between affordability and usability. It's a value phone that's still decently specced, built around a screen that prioritizes comfort. When I reviewed the Nxtpaper 60 Ultra a couple of months ago, I thought the price was fair, but at around 500 euros it also wasn't cheap. And that alone makes a screen comfort first concept harder to recommend to a broad audience. Now the Nxtpaper 70 Pro sits around 300 euros, and that changes the value proposition completely. You still get the core Nxtpaper benefits, like the super low reflection display, and TCL didn't cut on the practical stuff either. There's still stylus support, there's still ingress protection, and the display is now TUV certified for zero flicker, which is another nice benefit if you're sensitive to eye strain. But of course, to hit that lower price point, TCL did have to make compromises on a few things. So let's talk about where those compromises show up. Starting with the build quality, the Nxtpaper 70 Pro feels very similar to the Nxtpaper 60 Ultra, but with a couple of small tweaks that make it a bit nicer in the hand. The most noticeable one is the back cover. On the 70 Pro, it no longer spills over the side edge, which makes that rear edge feel smoother and a little more pleasant to hold. And that improved hand feel isn't just down to that one change. The phone has a 6.9-inch display and as a result is also slightly smaller and lighter, literally just a couple of millimeters and a few grams, but it adds up. It's one of those sum of its parts improvements you actually notice in everyday use. It's still a fully plastic build though, it's well made, it doesn't feel flimsy, but it also doesn't have that high-end charm you get from some competitors. And I'd say the biggest design improvement is the much smaller camera island on the back. The 60 Ultra had this massive circular camera bump that was almost as thick as the rest of the phone. The Nxtpaper 70 Pro goes for a more conventional camera module that's less eye-catching. Though the downside is that the phone can feel a bit wobblier when you place it on a desk. That redesign also comes with changes to the camera setup. The Nxtpaper 70 Pro drops the telephoto camera, but it keeps the 50 megapixel main and the 8 megapixel ultra wide, just with slightly different specs this time around. I'll come back to actual camera performance in a moment. The back cover is still made from that pleasant to touch, soft plastic, and it pairs really nicely with the nano-edged front glass. The button layout is basically identical to the 60 Ultra. On the right side, you've got the volume rocker, the power button, which also doubles as a fingerprint reader, and the signature Nxtpaper key. The left side is completely clean. Down at the bottom, you get the speaker, the USB-C port, and a dual SIM tray that also supports microSD. And that's actually a meaningful upgrade over the 60 Ultra, because it means you can expand the 256 or 512 gigs of internal storage on the Nxtpaper 70 Pro. You can also see the little water protective ring around the SIM tray because yes, this phone is IP68 dust and water protected. Spec-wise, the Nxtpaper 70 Pro runs on a MediaTek Dimensity 7300 with 8 GB of RAM. That's a setup you'll see in a lot of phones around this price. And for everyday use, it's perfectly fine. In regular day-to-day use, it honestly doesn't feel any slower than the Dimensity 7400 in the Nxtpaper 60 Ultra. The difference is more noticeable once you start gaming. The 120Hz display makes navigating apps and the Android UI feel very smooth and responsive. And of course, it also supports 5G, which I normally wouldn't even mention if the early Nxtpaper lineup hadn't included a model that was still 4G only. The Nxtpaper 70 Pro sticks with the same 5200 mAh battery and 33 watt charging. No wireless charging and no reverse wired charging either. Now let's get to the interesting part, the Nxtpaper display. That's really the heart of why the 70 Pro stands out in this price bracket. And you can tell TCL is serious about it, because they're trying to establish Nxtpaper as a regular option across their phone and tablet releases, not just a one-off experiment. The most obvious advantage over a regular LCD or OLED is reflections. This nano-edge glass has a really strong anti-glare effect, and that alone can improve viewing comfort a lot. And what's interesting is, you only really realize how much glare a normal display throws at you once you switch to something that's almost reflectionless. On regular phones, you kind of learn to ignore reflections, you block them out mentally. But that still takes effort, even if it's unconscious. And once you've used a screen like this, that difference becomes pretty obvious when you switch back. That's also the reason why I'm actually still using the TCL Nxtpaper 10S tablet regularly. The review of that device is what kickstarted this channel almost 4 years ago. In addition to that, the display also uses a circular polarizer to reduce ambient reflections further. But Nxtpaper isn't just about the nano-etched glass. TCL also claims the display can reduce blue light emissions down to 3.41%. Now, whether you'll actually see that number in real use depends a lot on how you're using the phone, because it changes with the color mode, whether Nxtpaper mode is enabled, and your brightness level. So in day-to-day use, the reduction might not be as dramatic as that headline figure suggests. Still, after measuring the spectrum with the spectrometer, I can confirm there is a noticeable reduction under comparable settings when you put it next to typical flagship displays from Apple or Samsung. And yes, you can reduce blue light on pretty much any phone with an eye comfort mode. But that usually works by pushing everything warmer and more orange, which hurts color accuracy. On the Nxtpaper 70 Pro, that trade-off is not an issue. So why should you care at all? Blue light isn't some kind of instant danger, but it can affect your circadian rhythm, especially in the evening, and there's ongoing discussion around how light exposure and long screen time relate to eye comfort. And since most of us stare at screens for hours every day, I'll take any reduction that comes without major downsides. And last but not least, the phone has a TUV zero flicker certification, which helps those sensitive to such effects, which is typically most pronounced when looking at displays at lower brightness levels. Speaking of low brightness, I measured a minimum of 1.8 nits. That's good, and it should be dim enough for almost everyone. Some phones can go down to around 1 nit, and e-ink devices can typically go even lower. But for a regular phone display, 1.8 nits is already very usable at night. On the other end, TCL advertises up to 900 nits peak brightness. I measured 850 nits, which is a bit lower, but still within a reasonable tolerance. Outdoors readability is decent, and you don't get those mirror-like reflections you see on many other phones. But even when you enable Nxtpaper mode and the display starts to look very e-ink-like, it's still not actual e-ink. For better and for worse. On the one hand, not being e-ink means you don't get the same built-in limitations. Real e-ink phones tend to push you into a more deliberate kind of use, because the screen itself acts like a natural filter for fast-paced apps. Sure, you can still run those apps on most e-ink phones, but the experience usually isn't as smooth as on an LCD, and to be fair, for a lot of people trying to escape that dopamine-heavy phone experience, that's kind of the point. On the other hand, if you're mainly after eye comfort and you don't care about that intentional friction at all, then the Nxtpaper approach is a much better alternative. That said, coming back to the 850 nits I measured, that great readability and comfort doesn't hold up in true direct sunlight. In the shade, even on a bright day, it's still reasonably good. But once the sun hits the display directly, a reflective technology like e-ink is unsurprisingly still better. That nano-textured front glass slightly reduces clarity of the roughly 374 ppi resolution, the same way you see on many e-ink devices with a paper-like texture. Not a huge deal, but you might pick up on it if you're sensitive to that sort of thing or in direct comparison to a typical smartphone. Same as on the other Nxtpaper phones, TCL includes 3 different ink modes on the Nxtpaper 70 Pro, and you can toggle them with the dedicated hardware button. Besides the 2 regular ink modes, there's Max Ink mode, which is meant to maximize battery life by limiting what the phone can do. The good news is that you can now add your own apps to Max Ink mode, which wasn't possible on some of the earlier Nxtpaper devices I've used. So you're not stuck with something like Google Books. You can add the Kindle app, for example. One general downside with these Nxtpaper modes is the forced switching animation. It looks nice the first few times, but if you use the toggle regularly, that slight delay gets old pretty quickly. I guess that animation is used to hide some performance overhead during the transition. But the good news is, it's actually noticeably quicker on the Nxtpaper 70 Pro than on the other devices I tested. Roughly 3 seconds down from 5 seconds. The other 2 modes, a monochrome e-ink style mode and a color paper mode, do a pretty convincing job of mimicking the e-ink look and reducing blue light output further. So, long story short, this is an excellent display if you want better eye comfort, without many of the usual compromises that come with typical blue light reduction. And if you're thinking, why not just put a paper-like screen protector on a normal phone? Yes, you can. I'd say that gets you maybe 60 to 70% of what Nxtpaper delivers, but the nano-textured glass is simply better at handling reflections and glare. And it also preserves image quality better. A screen protector adds an extra layer on top of a glossy panel, and that usually softens the image more and impacts clarity more than a matte glass surface that's built into the display. The biggest surprise with the TCL Nxtpaper 70 Pro for me was the Stylus support. And I've got a couple of interesting observations. First, the stylus is optional, and it comes with the also optional case, where it snaps into a dedicated slot on the back. I actually prefer this approach over the somewhat makeshift pen holder on the Nxtpaper 60 Ultra. But it comes with its own compromises. The most obvious one, the stylus is flat, which is naturally less comfortable than a typical round pen. That said, if you wanted to fit into the case without adding a lot of bulk, a flat shape is basically the compromise you have to make. And I'd argue it's a smart one. Realistically, you're not going to write pages of text on a phone-sized display anyway. So holding the pen for hours isn't a common scenario. For short bursts of note-taking on the go, it's still perfectly usable. One thing that does bother me though is how tight the pen fits in that slot. And by tight, I mean it's genuinely difficult for me to get it out with my fingers. I assumed it would loosen up over time, but even after a couple of weeks, it feels exactly the same as day one. That might be great for long-term durability, months and years of use. But right now, it's honestly just annoying. I'd say at this point, I'm genuinely considering lightly scraping off a tiny bit of plastic just to loosen the grip. But aside from that, the stylus experience is surprisingly good. And I really can't emphasize the surprisingly part enough. Because when you look at the tip, it's this mesh-like design that immediately reminds me of those generic capacitive styluses with no proper protocol support. So when I first saw it, I honestly feared the worst. I thought this was going to be a pretty bad writing experience. But I was very wrong. First of all, the combination of the textured display and that pen tip creates a really nice resistance. Honestly, not that far off from what you get on many e-ink tablets with a paper-like surface. Another pleasant surprise is control. Even though the tip isn't as pointy, you still get a good amount of precision. Sure, it's not as accurate as a finer stylus, but it's way better than I expected. What's also great is the sound, or more specifically, what you don't get. It doesn't have that hollow pen-on-glass tapping noise that a lot of capacitive pens have. The tip is relatively soft, so contact with the screen sounds more muted. And when you move the pen across the surface, you do get a slight scratching sound. But that's not really a bad thing by itself. In fact, it's not too different from what you hear on many e-ink devices with textured screens. The only small issue is that the noise can become a bit more pronounced when you move the pen faster. It never quite crosses into squeaky or genuinely unpleasant territory, but it gets close enough that you notice it. That's already getting pretty nitpicky, but it's worth mentioning. And last but not least, latency. In the TCL Notes app, I measured around 10 milliseconds, which is exceptionally good. There also seems to be some predictive stroke algorithm at work here, although I'm not a huge fan of it. On the software side, note-taking is relatively basic. The built-in Notes app includes a handwriting feature with 2 pen types instead of 3 on the Nxtpaper 60 Ultra, basic color and stroke options, and a few page templates. There's also a handwriting smoothing pen type, but that's about it. Don't expect anything close to what you'd get from a dedicated e-ink note-taking device. So truth be told, this stylus is much better than the whole setup makes you assume it'll be, especially at the price point of the TCL Nxtpaper 70 Pro. And even though the software experience isn't on par with e-ink devices, the fact that this is more like a portable notepad to scribble down something quickly on the go, I imagine it's still good enough for most use cases. I'd say just don't rely on this as your main note-taking or sketching tool. Something like the remarkable Paper Pro Move would be a better choice for that, despite having its own issues as well. Let's now take a quick look at the overall UI, which is mostly unremarkable. And in this case, that's actually a good thing. The phone runs Android 16, which is great to see, and TCL hasn't gone overboard with customization. Aside from the Nxtpaper toggle and a few TCL-specific features, this is still a fairly clean, mostly stock-like experience. And unlike some earlier TCL devices, the content center that was accessed by swiping down on the home screen's gone, which I definitely don't mind. So right out of the box, the software feels a bit cleaner and less cluttered. As far as I know, TCL still hasn't made any major long-term promises when it comes to software updates. So if you're someone who keeps a phone for many years and really values extended OS and security support, that's still something to keep in mind. And finally, let's talk about the camera. This is obviously not a camera phone and it's not trying to compete with flagships, but the results are perfectly fine still. Even though the setup is a little different, overall image quality is still very similar to the Nxtpaper 60 Ultra. In daylight, the main camera gives you good dynamic range, low noise and decent detail. And the sharpening feels better balanced than on the Nxtpaper 60 Ultra. By default, photos are again taken at a lower 13 megapixel resolution with pixel binning. And that's honestly fine. You can switch to the full 50 megapixel mode if you want, but just like before, the real-world gain is limited. For most people, the standard mode is the one to stick with. The ultra-wide camera is still clearly the weaker one. It's usable and it's nice to have the flexibility, but image quality does take a noticeable hit compared to the main sensor. So it's more of a convenience feature than something you'll want to rely on all the time. Video is okay as well, but again, it's not a standout. The good news is that 4K video is better than on the 60 Ultra, because it no longer has that weird tearing effect I noticed there. So in that sense, TCL has clearly improved things. There's a small stutter if you look closely, but sharpness is good, and for casual clips, it's absolutely usable. So all in all, I have to say, this is the easiest Nxtpaper phone to recommend right now. Not because it's trying to be a flagship killer, and not because it wins on raw specs, but because it hits the sweet spot between performance, features, and price better than any of the previous Nxtpaper phones I've tested. The biggest reason, of course, is still the display. That remains the most obvious USP of the whole device. The reduced reflections, the lower blue light output, the matte surface, the overall viewing comfort, it really does make a difference in day-to-day use. No, it's not e-ink, and it doesn't fully replace what an actual e-ink device does. But if you just want a phone that's noticeably more comfortable to look at than a regular glossy smartphone, TCL still has something genuinely useful here. And then there's the stylus support, which honestly was one of the biggest surprises for me. That setup has its compromises, especially that annoyingly tight grip in the case, which I still think is a bit too extreme. But once you actually start writing with it, the performance is much better than the design initially makes you expect. And on top of that, it simply offers great value for money. It doesn't do everything perfectly, but it gets a lot of the important things right. And more importantly, it does so at a price that makes the Nxtpaper concept much easier to recommend. So for me, this is currently the Nxtpaper phone that makes the most sense for most people. It's the most balanced one TCL has made so far, and the easiest one to recommend without having to explain away too many compromises. Like and subscribe if you found this really helpful. Thanks for your time watching, and I'll see you in the next one.